Jesus calming the storm on the sea reveals his power over evil, since the sea represents evil and chaos. Did you know that, by the way? It represents evil and chaos. The boat on the sea is a symbol of the church and invites us to trust God amid life's turbulence. A reading from Mark chapter 4. When evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Sisters and brothers in faith, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. I don't know about you, but it seems like we're afraid of so many things these days. Have you noticed that? Is it different than it used to be? It's hard to remember a time when we're not afraid. Terrorists, immigrants, stock market crashes, layoffs, North Korea and Iran getting the bomb, tornadoes, high cholesterol, trans fats, male pattern baldness, cancer, concealed weapons, lack of concealed weapons, road rage, inflation, deflation, and the list could go on forever and ever, couldn't it, of the things we're afraid of. It almost makes you pine for the good old days when all we had to fear was nuclear annihilation, right? I wonder, why are we so afraid all the time? Part of the reason is there actually are things to fear. You and I are vulnerable, and deep down we know it. Even though we are the healthiest, most well-fed people in history, we know that a tiny bug or an even tinier change in a single strand of DNA could be our end. Even though we're some of the richest people in history, we know by hard experience that our wealth that we've spent a lifetime accumulating could all be gone with just a pink slip or a health problem, or the risky act of a broker 1,000 miles away, or any of another million reasons. And even though we're the most powerful nation in the history of the planet, we know that we have enemies who hate us and who want to do us harm. Fear is all around us, and it's just below the surface all the time. And it only takes the sound of footsteps outside your window in the middle of the night, or a new mole on your skin to awaken that fear in you, doesn't it? And in some ways, fear is good. I mean, fear helps us get away or avoid real dangers, and that's good. Fear reminds us also that we are not gods, small g. If you are immortal, if you're a god, if there's nothing that can hurt you, then you would have no need to fear. But since you know you are vulnerable and you know you are not a god, you are a creature, utterly dependent on something or someone else for your existence. And that's actually good. Knowing that you and I are not God is the very first step in our keeping the first commandment, right? I ain't God, somebody else is. And then fear leads to the second step, which is calling out to the one who really is God. And we call that calling out to God prayer, right? And that's what the disciples did that night in the boat. They were professional fishermen. They knew all about the weather and survival on the lake, but this storm had caught them, and they were going to sink, and they knew it, and in their fear they called out, they prayed to Jesus. "Teacher, wake up! Don't you care that we're dying here?" The fact that Jesus was asleep in the middle of the storm does sound like he doesn't care, doesn't it? Can you sleep through storms? I can't. Ever since 1965, when I was a little kid and a tornado went through our neighborhood, broke all the windows in my house, I can't sleep when it storms. In fact, I'm the first one that rushes down to the basement, even now. I mean, that's like 60 years later almost. But Jesus could sleep right through it. In the Old Testament, the ability to sleep peacefully and untroubled was a sign of perfect trust in the protective power of God. So maybe Jesus slept because he trusted God completely. Or maybe Jesus was just a heavy sleeper. We don't know for sure. Either way, the disciples cry out for him to wake up. And that's also a rich biblical tradition. I don't know if you know that, but several Psalms cry out in almost the same words that the disciples use. For example, Psalm 44 and Isaiah 51, they both say, "Wake up, Lord. Why are you asleep? Don't forget our trouble and suffering." To us, it kind of feels disrespectful to address God that way. Wake up, God. But the writers of the Bible are not shy about it at all. When they feel like God isn't paying attention to them, that only causes them to pray louder and louder. We used to be afraid of planes exploding and buildings falling down. Lately, we've been afraid of poor people seeking refuge at our border and rising health care prices. Do you know what made the people of the Bible afraid? Water. Stormy, chaotic seas. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because water was their means of transportation, and ships, no matter how well they were built, often went down under the wind and waves in those days. Or maybe it was because they didn't know how to swim. Or maybe it was because life jackets weren't invented yet. I don't know. Bishop John Anderson from Southwest Minnesota, he's a classmate of mine. He had tried for years and years to learn to swim. This guy is a great big football player. You'd think he can do anything, but he couldn't swim. And he would flail and thrash about in the water, and he took some lessons to try and learn, and it didn't get him anywhere. And one day he saw one of his confirmands, a girl on the high school swim team, come to the pool area, and after the lesson he went to her and asked, "What can I do to be a better swimmer?" And she said, "Remember, people float." Just remember that people float. But on this night of wind and waves, floating was not going to be enough. They cried to Jesus to wake up, help them. And he woke up and said to the wind and the waves, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. And then they were really afraid, it says. Isn't that a strange reaction? Who is this guy? His raw power was just terrifying. They'd been walking all over Palestine with him. They'd been watching him heal all sorts of diseases, cast out demons. Who did they think they were dealing with all this time? And then Jesus, still a little sleepy, or at least this is the way I see him, he's still a little sleepy. He said the same thing to them as I said to my kids when they were afraid at night. Why are you afraid? And can you see him rubbing his eyes and scratching like dads do when they wake up? And then he says something new. Have you no faith? That's a hard question. I mean, when I'm afraid, what is it that moves me from fear to faith? What does it move? Is there something that moves you from fear to faith? Usually just saying, "Don't be afraid," doesn't really do it. And apparently a miracle that Jesus performed didn't really do it either. What moved them and us from fear to faith isn't a what, it's a who. It's this Jesus who is right there in the boat with them. I used to say to my kids, I'd say, "I'm here, nobody's going to hurt you." And they'd go back to sleep. Not really realizing how impotent I am, but anyway, they would go back to sleep. But is that what faith is? Just trust, so that you can go back to sleep knowing that he's still here. It sounds like the opposite of faith for Jesus is not unbelief. The opposite of faith is fear. Faith is knowing Jesus was with them all along, right there in the boat. Jesus knows what's going on, and he will always be there for them. Faith means trusting him. Many people think this is a story about the church. I mean, if you go, not this church, but if you go to an older church and look up at the ceiling, they were built to remind worshipers of a boat and of this story. Can you imagine it? You know, they have those big ribs that go to the center, and then there's the keel piece that goes right down the center. The planks are lined up all along the outside, holding out the water like the great walls of the ship. The very architecture was designed to remind worshipers of Jesus' presence and Jesus' words. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? Jesus is right here with us, right here in the boat, all the time. The one who stills the storm with just a word can speak a word also to anything that you are afraid of. You and I, we will be tossed about, but there is no reason to fear because he is with you always. And even your worst enemy will be stilled by just a word from him when he says to you and me, arise. At my previous parish, a group of us visited an ELCA mission congregation on Wednesday evening. The church was called Prisoners of Hope Lutheran Church, and it met inside Appleton Prison in Appleton, Minnesota. I'm not sure it's still open. I think they closed the prison, not the church, but anyway, it was there. About 50 men would gather in a cement block room locked with great iron doors, and outside the doors there were thick bars, and outside the bars were 2 tall fences with a 30-foot space between them. And on top of each fence were 3 rolls of razor wire spiraling around the property as far as you could see. And the message was inescapable. You cannot leave. You belong to us. Fear and intimidation. But inside that room, behind the razor wire and the bars and the iron doors and the armed guards, these 50 men sang loudly. And they prayed publicly and honestly for their families and for their fellow inmates. They greeted us warmly, just like you greet visitors here. And all that fear around, they were not afraid, these men. They were at peace because they knew Jesus was there in the prison, even in the prison, with them. And he had somehow stilled the storms in their lives. At Prisoners of Hope Lutheran Church in Appleton Prison, Jesus was there. And Jesus is here at Salem Lutheran Church in Deerwood. And like theirs, our little ship is often tossed about. Sometimes we are afraid too. But fear is the first step of faith because it makes us call out to our Lord. And the good news is, always, always, he is there in the boat with you and me. And he stills the storm in your life. He gives you peace no matter what waves are tossing you about. Because there is no storm, there is no chaos that he cannot calm. Just a word from him is all it takes. Peace. Be still.